Good morning, everyone. I am really so honored and grateful for the opportunity to be with all of you in this holy community, and even just to watch the live stream of the service in your sacred space, which has been a place of incredible inspiration for me over the years. As I shared in the Rector's Forum, and I've spoken about so many times. Reverend Ed Bacon, my dear friend, has invited me many times over the years, and now Reverend Mike Kinman into this space. And I feel deeply honored and blessed by your friendship and by your partnership in the work. In fact, as I'm looking at the video, I see the exact pew that I was sitting in the first time I went to All Saints when I had truly a revelatory experience that helped me not only understand Christianity, but understand my own Judaism, which was when I recognized, as Reverend Ed Bacon shared the story of Christmas on Christmas Eve many years ago, that our narratives were very different narratives, but the truths that we were working to uncover and the society that we were working to build together are very much on the same path. And so I just feel so blessed to be here with all of you, really, as a very much as a partner and as a friend in this work. I also want to thank you for lifting up this morning the story of Ruth and Naomi. And I'm not going to be focusing on that in my time with you this morning. But I do want to say a quick word about it because it is related to what I want to speak about. This is a story, as many of you know, of loss and love and redemption. And it occurs in the context of climate devastation. So I just want to lift up and remind us that it is the context of famine that drives Naomi and Elimelech, her husband, and their two sons from their home to Moab in the first place. They are climate refugees. And when they arrive in Moab, they are already profoundly vulnerable. And there they encounter even greater suffering. If you remember from the story, Elimelech dies, and Naomi is left as a single mother and a foreigner and a refugee. Her two sons marry, but then both of the sons die as well. It's tragedy on top of tragedy until the main character of this narrative, really, Naomi, is completely shattered. And it's from that brokenness that Ruth, one of her daughters-in-law, says to her, Ki el asher telchi elech. She says, wherever you go, I will go. And where you're buried, I will be buried, and your people will be my people. And so I just want to lift up for us the reminder from this incredible, very old story that redemption and love are often born out of anguish. And so may it be for us in our time as well. So I'll share with you that sometime last March, now 15 months ago, shortly after the safer at home orders came down, I was on the phone late one night with a very dear friend, a sick American activist and lawyer named Valerie Kaur. I imagine that some of you might have read her new book, which just came out, called See No Stranger, which I have sitting right on my desk. And what she said to me is the following. She said, Sharon, I need your Jewish wisdom. I need to know how to navigate these times, and Jewish people know what to do when one world dies and another world is born. And I was so shaken awake by her question. I really took the challenge to heart, and I started to read, and I started to think, and really to learn into my own text in a different way. I started to read stories of Holocaust survivors, of people who had lost absolutely everything and yet went on to build families and futures. And I started to dig even deeper into my past and the past of my people. I dove into stories about blood libels and pogroms and exiles, really trying to understand how my people, through times far more challenging than the ones we were living through, found the strength to lay old worlds to rest and to begin to build new ones in their place. And that journey of learning ended up shaping for me this whole era of pandemic and recovery. I ended up speaking about this on Rosh Hashanah and talking about it and thinking about it with my children at dinner night after night, and really whenever I'm given a platform. Because what I was so captivated by was a narrative that took place 2,000 years ago that I believe offers us a foundation that can help us understand how to live through the times that we're living in right now. This is the story of a group of rabbis, teachers, and students who escaped Jerusalem moments before the temple was destroyed 2,000 years ago, and who set out to rebuild the Judaism that any Jew you know today is the inheritor of. So first, let me just offer you some context. This was about 3 years into the Roman siege of Jerusalem in the year 70. And the whole city was surrounded by hunger, and the people were increasingly desperate. And one of the leaders of the Jewish community in Jerusalem at that time was named Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And he determined that there was no future in this city and that they had to escape. So he concocted a plan in which his students placed him in a coffin as though he were dead, and then marched him out of the gates of the city as though they were transporting his body to burial. Once they got out, the rabbi and the students emerged from the grips of death in this besieged city, and they were granted permission to build a small community in a town called Yavne, which is not far from Jerusalem. It was close enough that they described that they could smell the fire when Jerusalem was taken just a short time later by Vespasian Caesar and his legions, when they breached the walls of the city and they burned to the ground the Beit HaMikdash, the temple, our holiest of holy sites, the center of Jewish religious and spiritual practice. The Romans sought not only to destroy these sacred sites, but to humiliate and to annihilate the population. Those who weren't murdered in that time died from starvation or were brought in chains to Rome, where they were debased and degraded and humiliated for sport. A chorban, we called it throughout history. A chorban, a complete and total devastation. So, what did the rabbis, these few survivors, do in the face of all of that destruction? The Talmud tells us, and our tradition tells us, that they tore their clothes, they cried, and they screamed, and they lamented. You might have seen the practice among many Jewish people that when we grieve, when we stand at the graveside, we tear our garments. And the idea is it's a physical externalizing of the internal tear, the rip in our hearts. This is where it originated. They mourned. They mourned for the desolation. They mourned for the desecration of holy sites. They mourned for the deaths of loved ones. They wept. They cried out names of those they lost, of those that they couldn't save. And they did something really interesting. They committed to memory as much as they possibly could of the sacred stories of those who had been lost, even the most mundane details of their lives and their teachings, their Torah. They committed it to memory, and they taught us that grief is a spiritual and a moral mandate. And Pastor Kinman and I were just talking about this moments ago in the Rector's Forum. Grief as a moral mandate. It was true in the ancient world, and it's true today. Public grief, an act of rebellion against the world as it is. It means not letting anyone disappear from this world. And there's so many different ways to grieve. It means lifting up the stories of those who've died. It means saying their names again and again and again. And I want to ask us to think about what we've seen in America in this past year after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. What happened in April in Brooklyn Center as an expression of public grief, a taking to the street as a way of refusing to normalize this loss of life, refusing to accustom ourselves to this loss of life. In the case of my ancestors, the weight of that tragedy was felt not for one day, not for a month, not for a year, but for generations. And so still today, nearly 2,000 years later, we mark sacred time around those losses. You might know that every year Jews from all over the world will sit down on the floor and fast and read from the book of Lamentations. That is a reflection of our holding on to the memory of and public grieving for that act of destruction that happened nearly 2,000 years ago. And we shatter glass beneath the chuppah at every wedding ceremony. The sound of broken glass reminding us, even in our most joyous moments, to hold the weight of that loss. Its memory is never far from us. And it's really critical for us today because we live in a society that too often treats public grief like it's a sign of weakness. But it's actually willful amnesia that's the weakness. It's grief and it's memory that are the greatest reflections of resiliency and of love. Public mourning is both a sacred practice and it's a social necessity. It's a moral imperative, especially after catastrophic loss, because it forces us to reckon and to wrestle with the circumstances that actually gave rise to that unspeakable loss in the first place. So, as I shared in the Rector's Forum, we've been working collectively as a community to try to identify ways that we can engage in that kind of public grieving, sacred spaces where our broken hearts can be what we lead with. Because we know that mourning affirms that every human life is precious. There's a story in my tradition that I've been thinking of since the murder of George Floyd that says that wherever we go, every single person created in God's own image is surrounded by a procession of angels shouting and blowing shofarot, blowing trumpets, saying, "Make way, for an image of the Holy One is approaching." It's the most radical idea in a society that treats human life as though it doesn't even matter. Imagine if we believed that every single one of us is created in God's own image, deserving of dignity in life and in death. Grief is one of the most powerful affirmations of that theological claim and one of the most powerful expressions of love. It's a cry from out of the depths of our being that what is not what ought to be. The wisdom of our ancestors calls to us saying there's no shortcutting this process. You can't just get back to normal. A society that does not honor its dead will absolutely fail to honor its living. But the story that our rabbis tell doesn't just end with torn clothing and with grieving. When the rabbis tell the story of Jerusalem's destruction, of all of that death and enslavement and destruction and desecration, they invite a logic of truth-telling into the landscape of incalculable loss. They do something incredibly audacious. They ask in the Talmud, in a tractate called Yoma, why was the temple destroyed? And their answer might take you by surprise. Mipnei shehaita bo sinat chinam, they say. The second temple, our most sacred, our holiest site, the center of Jewish life, was destroyed because of senseless hatred. Our senseless hatred, not the Roman legions, our cowardice and hypocrisy and callousness, which had become normative in our Jewish community until it destroyed us from within. I want to ask you to think about what that means for a moment. Rather than blame the Romans, the legions that came in intent on devastating and destroying us with incredible acts of violence, the rabbis hold up a mirror. They try to understand our own complicity. In what ways did we accede to cultural norms that left us susceptible to the violence that ultimately destroyed us? They identify the weaknesses in the system. Too many people willing to turn a blind eye when their neighbors were demoralized and dehumanized. And they tell stories, small stories, about humiliations that happen at a party where someone shows up who wasn't invited and they're mortified in front of the crowd as a justification for why ultimately the temple was destroyed. Why were we destroyed? Because too many people stayed silent and towed the status quo. Too many people were willing to hide behind their privilege. Too many people sold their last principles for a chance to get in bed with power. Too many people contributed to the moral vacuum that would be filled only by extremists, known as biryonim in the language of the Talmud, extremists who brought our society to the brink and ultimately to destruction. What the rabbis did was they told the truth. And I imagine that must have been a very hard call for them. It's really hard to hear the truth. It's hard to hear that our dislocation, our suffering, could be in part a result not of someone else's failures, but of our own failures, of leadership, of courage, of imagination. It's so much easier to blame the other. It takes so much more courage to actually look at ourselves and try to understand the ways that we are complicit in the suffering that we're experiencing. But the rabbis really understood something about the human heart. They understood something about healing. You can't put a Band-Aid on an infected wound and expect that it will miraculously heal. Not when what you need is aggressive surgery. There comes a time, they were telling us, when the only way forward is through the truth. When we're called to speak not only about where it hurts, but to investigate the conditions that allowed for the sickness to spread in the first place. Not only to report how many people have been killed by a virus, but also why a public health crisis became a culture war in our country. Who profits from that? And why were so many people willing to leave old people and Black people and brown people and poor people and imprisoned people to die from this virus? There comes a time when we must not only tell each other the stories of yet another unarmed Black man being killed by law enforcement while crying out for his mother, but also when we look at systems that have protected and perpetuated violent and racist abuses of power over generations. And yes, not only to grieve the deaths of those who died in the fighting in Israel-Palestine last month, but also to tell the truth about the root causes, about the factors that led to that outbreak of violence in the first place. The danger of truth-telling is that it forces us to confront underlying conditions. Here in the United States, as we've reckoned with all kinds of inconvenient truths over this past year, we've uncovered political corruption, an addictive attachment to white supremacy, a spirit of apathy and indifference, a broken economy that again and again rewards profit over human dignity, that feeds the toxic myth of radical individualism and eviscerates any sense of collective responsibility. It's really painful to confront all of these challenges. And yet there's a story that I think about all of the time, which is brought by a Hasidic teacher, the Shalom Rabbi, in a text called Netivot Shalom. He himself comes from a Hasidic dynasty that was essentially wiped out in the Holocaust. And he made his way to Eretz Yisrael, to the land. And he, as a survivor in that place, began to write and to write and to write. And he tells the story about a house that's built on a rotten foundation. And without fail, cracks begin to appear in the walls of this house. And the homeowner is so insistent on making this house look like it's healthy that the homeowner will paint over those cracks until more cracks appear, and then plaster over those cracks until it becomes clear that the only way to save this house from collapsing on itself is to lift it up, to uproot it, and to clean out the foundation below, and then rebuild the house in a healthy and secure and safe way for all of its inhabitants. That can only happen when we're willing to tell the truth about where those cracks are actually coming from in the first place. Our ancestors, my ancestors, they called us to grieve and to tell the truth, and then to begin to rebuild. And as Pastor Mike and I are talking and thinking and dreaming together about what it means to rebuild, I want to ask us to think about what the rabbis taught us so long ago. I am sure that those who fled Jerusalem and watched their entire world burn to the ground were desperate to just get back to normal. But there was no going back because the sorrow and the suffering that they'd experienced taught them something. It lifted the veil on what they could not see before. They learned from all that loss and from all the truth telling that the paradise that they lived in was not a paradise for everybody, that Jerusalem was a beautiful mansion that had been built on a rotten foundation, that the sickness of senseless hatred had taken root in the soil. And so their most urgent task was not to return to what was, it was to rebuild, but not to replicate. What kind of world did they strive to rebuild? Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that rabbi who was carried out of Jerusalem in a coffin, he tells his students, there's no going back. Our work now is to build something new. The world that died was soaked in sinat chinam, in senseless hatred. Olam chesed yibaneh, says Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Now, our task is to build a world of love, a counter-testimony to the world that we laid to rest back there. And that is exactly what they did. From the embers, they birthed a new Judaism, a society that died on the sword of its own rigidity, became known for its adaptability. In place of sacrifices, they developed a world of personal prayer. In place of callousness, they birthed a world of compassion and love, a new world that reflected how much they had learned from the old. I read this today as an invitation, as a challenge for us. After everything we've been through, what new world can we build? A counter testimony to the inequities and injustices that were laid bare in this time of heartache that we have all lived through. So I ask you to consider this morning, what is the new world that we are called to imagine together? I imagine a world that centers justice and equity and human dignity. One in which the privilege of being human comes with the sacred responsibility to protect and to defend those who are most vulnerable and this earth, which sustains us all. A world in which we recognize that our liberation is tied up in one another. It's not one of us or the other, it's all of us. A world in which we truly know and believe that we belong to one another. This is a blueprint for us, an ancient wisdom born out of suffering, a three-part offering to us from the depths and from the heart of my Jewish tradition. First, let us grieve. Let us become the storytellers of our generation. Let us create the most generative, the most creative, the most imaginative forms of public grieving and ritual. Let us read and write and weep together for all that we've lost. Affirm, console, wrestle, and remember. And then we have to practice telling the truth, to be more honest than we're used to being. Truth telling is a muscle that we have to practice. We have to be willing to get uncomfortable. And finally, we have to dream audaciously of what the next chapter will look like. We have to stretch our imagination. This moment, our time, this is an inflection point, a once-in-a-generation opportunity for transformation. What must we build from out of the ashes? This is the image that I've held through this past year plus. The image of a great rabbi wrapped in a coffin playing dead so that he can, in fact, be alive. Sneaking past the walls of a mighty city that's been weakened by hatred. A teacher who is at once brokenhearted and already dreaming of a new love-driven reality. If we listen closely, we hear the whispers of the past, from our shared loss, from our dislocation, from our brokenness and our grief. We are given the opportunity to transform this time of collective heartache into an era, not only of moral awakening, but of collective rebirth. That's what we're doing. That's what we must do. Build a new world in which each of us is called to the sacred task of tipping the scales toward love and justice. For many, many years, I have seen all of you as partners in this work. And I say to you again today, it is a great honor to stand on the same side of history as all of you. I thank you for your work and for your hearts.